Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of iTOOsday. We are joined this morning by the esteemed Clem Sunter. I always look forward to these sessions when we've got Clem Sunter on the call because I know you're about to have a download of knowledge. Clem is a scenario planner, a futurist, and keynote speaker, and actually an author. Some of you who may have attended our previous session with Clem Sunter will probably have a copy of his book that we gave out. And Clem just confessed to me right now that he also was in a rock band very many moons ago. So he's a rock star also. So we are very privileged to have you on the call, Clem. And we're looking forward to everything that you've got to share with us today.
Thank you so much. And I feel it's a real privilege to talk to you guys today. I want to do three things. I want to talk about the methodology that I use to look at the future, because it's a wonderful thing to use in terms of your own company or your own family. It's the best way of making decisions about the future. So I want to go through a bit of the history of that. I then want to talk about the global flags and scenarios to give a context to obviously what we're all worried about, which is the South African scenarios post the election, and that'll be at the end. The story starts really in the early 80s. My company, Anglo-American, had made a real hash of all its forecasting of gold prices and diamond demand and other things during the 1970s. And we learnt about this technique that Royal Dutch Shell, the oil company, was using in London called scenario planning, where they'd managed to capture both oil price shocks in the 70s in scenarios. The one in the early 70s where it went from $6 to $12 a barrel, and then in the late 70s from $12 to $40 a barrel, which gave them a edge on their competitors. And the head of their scenario team in London, a Frenchman called Pierre Wack, was just about to retire. And so we invited him out to Johannesburg to give us a lecture at Anglo-American to the executive committee. I was the secretary of the committee at the time. And he gave us a wonderful presentation on how you should look at the future using scenario planning. And the chairman of the meeting, Gavin Relly, looked around the room, and there I was sitting as secretary. And he said, I hope, Clem, in addition to your normal mining responsibilities, you'll take on this extra job. And I said, of course. And it was the most incredible experience I had, because Pierre Wack then became a consultant to Anglo. He brought along some of his remarkable circle of futurists, and we put together not only global scenarios, but also the high road and low road for South Africa, the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And I can promise you, in the mid-80s, when I was allowed to give talks to the public and even wrote a book about it and made a video, a lot of people said, this is a fairy tale stuff. There is no way that the National Party will sit down with the ANC and negotiate the future. But that's exactly what they did, due to the brilliant leadership of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. They did negotiate a political solution, and it showed the power of the methodology, because we could never have forecast that was going to happen, but we could capture it in a scenario. So Pierre eventually retired, and he handed on certain bits of advice to me during the 1990s. One was that you should never allow emotion to get in the way of your looking at the future. You've got to look at the evidence coming in a very cold and calculating way to ensure that you get the right scenarios. He also said you can't be precise about the future. In fact, he had a great phrase, it's much better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. And so the method he used was to look at the driving forces, which I call the flags, which are driving the present into the future. And he says that'll close the cone of uncertainty, because you can't write scenarios which conflict with the flags. And it's a kind of compromise. It's not like being the Delphic Oracle where you give 360-degree scenarios. You're actually trying to give realistic range of scenarios within the driving forces or the flags. And then the third point that he made really was that you've got to really every day look at the news and what's coming in to see whether you should alter the probabilities on the scenarios. You can't just do the work and then stop. You've got to look on a daily basis to test the scenarios that you've written. Anyway, after he'd retired, and given this kind of methodology, I was lucky to meet a young woman who was doing a thesis at the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town called Chantel Ilbury. And she was doing it on using scenario planning in small business. And it was such a good thesis, I said, we must write a book together. It took us a few months to write it, and we published it in June 2001, and it was called The Mind of a Fox. And we chose that title because of a Greek poet called Archilochus, who said, the fox knows many things, whereas the hedgehog only knows one big thing. And we thought this was a lovely way to contrast scenario planning, where you look at a variety of futures and then you check out which one's coming into play, which is the foxy approach, compared to the sort of hedgehog approach of relying on a single future. And what's really nice is that America's most popular futurist, a man called Philip Tetlock, recently wrote a book called Super Forecasting, where he used this metaphor of the fox and the hedgehog. And he said it's those futurists who constantly check the probabilities of their forecasts by looking at the evidence that do much better than those who think that they can just make one intuitive forecast. So he said he's done the scientific study showing foxes are much better at looking at the future than hedgehogs. So it's a good technique. We use it a lot with both our local clients and also our overseas clients. My colleague Chantel Ilbury right now lives in England, and she's working with the city of Dubai to look at their futures, because obviously they want to continue their path of being a world-class hub for the world. And in that book, The Mind of a Fox, we had one example which really shows that it works. We wrote a book to George Bush. We wrote a letter to George Bush, which we included in the book, where we said, "Dear Mr. President, you've got to start thinking like a fox, because there are certain risks which you might face during your presidency. And your number one risk at the moment is a massive terrorist strike on a Western city." Well, we published the book in June 2001, and it happened 3 months later in September, 9/11. And when the Americans did a literature search, ours was the only book published anywhere in the world that in a direct letter to the president said, "This is your biggest threat." Why do I know this? Because I was rung up by a member of the State Department as a person of interest, I guess, saying, how on earth could two South Africans capture a scenario that no American intelligence agency did? And I said, because we had three flags. The first flag was the growing conflict between the major religions of the world that, was certainly coming to the fore in the 1990s, particularly Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. The second flag was the growing sophistication of the tactics used by terrorist groups. And the third was a very specific flag, which was that in 1998, Al-Qaeda attacked two American embassies in Africa, one in Tanzania and one in Kenya, which we felt might be a dress rehearsal for a real thing in the West. And so we'd raised the probability of this particular event. As Pierre said, we didn't say it was going to happen on this day, in this city, using planes flying into buildings. You couldn't possibly have that kind of precise detail, but you could see that the threat was rising. And it made our methodology incredibly popular around the world. So what are the flags that we're talking about today with our clients? Well, the number one flag is still the religious flag. I wrote an article for News 24 in July last year, in which I put it as the number one flag to watch, because, as I said in the article, we could have a repeat of the 9/11 type of event in Israel, and particularly with Iran developing a nuclear weapon. And of course, it happened 3 months after I published that article on News 24 in Israel. And I've had a lot of people saying to me from around the world, how on earth could you capture that particular threat when the Israeli intelligence agency didn't actually do that? And again, I said, it's not because I knew it was going to happen at that time. It was just because, you know, when you looked at Israel in July last year, it was very vulnerable because it was divided over all the reforms being suggested by Benjamin Netanyahu to the judiciary system, which would have weakened it. And secondly, settlers were still taking land in the West Bank, which was increasing the anger of Palestinians, so that these kind of extra factors had raised the threat of the religious flag. And sadly, it is a very cloudy flag, because, you know, what's happened is absolutely dreadful. I see that the International Criminal Court has actually, suggesting charges against not only the Hamas leaders, but also the Israeli leaders as sort of war criminals because of the dreadful stuff that has gone on. Obviously, the original attack was dreadful, but equally what's happening in Gaza today is absolutely dreadful. So, you know, one's got to look at how one can reach a positive conclusion where, you know, Israelis and Palestinians can once again work together. But it's very hard to see through the fog at the moment, the fog of war, because it's still going on. The second flag is the leadership flag, which really I only put into my portfolio of flags quite recently. But it's the point that world leaders can have a significant impact on your life whilst you're living it. So it's a total accident who is a world leader whilst you're alive, but it can affect your life. I mean, my father was working in a bank in London during the 1930s, and his life was completely changed in 1939 when he had to join the British Army to fight in the Second World War. And thank heavens he survived it, and then started a new occupation after the war. But it was all because there was this young leader in Germany called Adolf Hitler, which changed his life. We've had some very positive leaders. I mean, at the end of the 1980s, we had Maggie Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who developed a positive relationship, got rid of the Cold War, got rid of the Berlin Wall, got rid of the Soviet Union. And, you know, they did an incredibly wonderful thing for the world together. Now, I'm afraid to say, we have three leaders who, you know, are very much not in touch with one another. I mean, you have Joe Biden, who is incredibly old. In fact, so old he probably wouldn't qualify for my retirement village. You have Putin, who is obviously not a nice guy at all. I mean, you know, people who oppose him get assassinated or poisoned. And you have Xi, who's more of a Maoist now than his predecessors, like Deng Xiaoping. And yes, recently there was a meeting between Putin and Xi, and they expressed solidarity with one another. But, you know, in terms of seeking a solution to the world, you really would like to have other leaders around, and we'll have to wait for the next generation. And possibly one of those members of the next generation will be the Indian Prime Minister, because India may well become the biggest economy in the world in the second half of the century. But again, it's a very cloudy flag. The third flag I talked a lot about in a book called Flag Watching, which I published in 2015. It's the red flag of China, Russia, and North Korea. In terms of Russia, it was the Ukrainian war, which, well, it wasn't the war, it was the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And the fact that they were moving up the east part of Ukraine, which suggested that this could turn into a real conflict, as it did, you know, much later. And again, I don't know how this war is going to play out. It would appear that Russia is actually doing pretty well at the moment. It's launched a further offensive in the north, and Zelensky is pleading for more weapons. But ultimately, perhaps it's going to be not so much the weapons as the personnel. Russia just has so many people that can be recruited into their army compared to Ukraine. So I'm not sure whether this war will end up in a kind of negotiation. I don't know how it will end, but certainly it is a flag that has to be watched every day. The second country is China. And China has one issue, which it is at conflict with America, which is the status of Taiwan. China has made it very clear that it is part of China, and Taiwan has made it very clear, with the support of the United States, that it wants to maintain itself as an independent entity. And yeah, America and China are now the sort of two biggest rivals in the world. And Biden has just recently raised the tariffs on a whole bunch of Chinese goods which are exported to America, which certainly has not thrilled the Chinese. And so there's this constant conflict between the two countries, and there's the issue of Taiwan. The third country is North Korea, with this unpredictable leader, Kim Jong-un. And yeah, he has about 50 nuclear weapons. He suspended ballistic missile testing during Trump's presidency, but he's back to doing that. And obviously, if he really became serious in terms of the use of nuclear weapons, it would change the whole kind of arena in the Far East. So again, it's a flag that has to be watched. The next flag is one that is not a cloudy flag, it's a clockwork flag, because it's ticking away, and it's a trend with fairly precise consequences. It's the grey flag of the aging of the world's population. I remember Pierre saying to me in 1988, if Japan ever has a property or stock market crash, it will never grow economically again. And I was surprised, because we all thought Japan at the time was the sort of champion of the world. They had sort of 8% per annum economic growth rates. So why would Pierre be saying this? And he said, because they're the oldest country on earth. They have the highest percentage of people over 65 years old, and they don't consume as much, they don't innovate as much, they don't do as much. And naturally, a country's economic growth rate declines when it gets older. And it's not that they become more unhappy. I mean, Japan has a very low unemployment rate at the moment. People live a pretty good quality of life in Japan. So obviously you adjust the model, but the one thing that is absent is high economic growth with an aging population. Now, why is this so important? It's because it's hitting Europe and it's hitting the UK. And it's causing, you know, those countries probably to have economic growth rates of between 0.5% and 1%, as opposed to 3%. America, this flag, the grey flag, is only going to hit in the second half of the century. And therefore, America's economic growth rate right now, naturally, if it really recovers from the pandemic, will be between 3 and 5%. So I've said for a long time that, you know, if people are going to invest overseas, they should go to America rather than investing in the UK and Europe. And I've been proved exactly right, because the American stock market, the Dow Jones Industrial Index, has gone from 11,000 at the beginning of 2000 to 40,000 today. That's nearly 4 times, whereas the UK has gone from 7,000 to 8,400. So, you know, it's a very important flag that isn't often talked about. It's going to hit China. I mean, China's population is now declining. It's come down by 1 million. It's not very much from 1.4 billion, but there are a lot of long-term forecasts that say China's population could drop to around 800 million by the turn of the century. South America, Africa has still got young populations, which are growing. But of course, in addition to youth, you've got to have good government. That makes all the difference in terms of having an economy that's growing fast. The next flag is probably the most existential threat to the world at the moment. It's the green flag of climate change. And when I talk to environmentalists now, they all say to me, the one thing that has really surprised us is that all the changes to the weather that we thought were going to happen at the end of this century are happening now. It's come much quicker than we thought. And the one place which is beginning to really suffer these new trends of weather is California. They call the rainfall that they get atmospheric rivers, because what is happening is there's more water being evaporated from the ocean. It's being captured in the clouds because the clouds are warmer now, and then it's being channeled into these rivers, which send record amounts of rainfall onto particular areas of California. And this kind of channeling effect is now happening elsewhere. It's happened in Afghanistan. It's happened in Dubai. We are seeing very, very extreme weather happening. And of course, the very slow rising of sea levels is happening as well, which means the coastal cities will eventually come under threat. And yet, because of the leadership flag, or say the lack of leadership flag, we're not getting a proper and coherent strategy to fight climate change. We have these COP meetings every year, but they're just usual rhetoric. Nothing is actually happening. And one of the problems is that the green answers to reduce carbon emissions are quite expensive. It's now come to light that electric cars are expensive. And in fact, the demand for electric cars has tailed off, because to replace a battery on an electric car is an expensive thing to do. And the other thing is that countries don't necessarily have the kind of equivalent network of power charging stations that they have to petrol stations. And so there's so much more to do to provide easy answers to stopping using coal and stop using petrol and other things. And those aren't around at the moment. So it's a very important flag to watch, because it is already having major impact on countries. I mean, to the north of us, Zimbabwe is having a terrible drought, which has destroyed something like 70% of its crop. The same with Zambia. This is going to have a huge impact for our children and grandchildren. The next flag is the anti-establishment flag of increasing polarization within society, driven by rising inequality of income and by social media. We had a financial crash in 2008, and since that financial crash, the super rich have got back to being super rich again, but the middle class and poor people have not. They're struggling with the cost of living. around all the developed countries as well as the developing countries. And yeah, real wages and salaries haven't increased really since 2007. And this is causing serious problems of deciding where you're going to spend your money. And that causes a lot of anger amongst those people, which has meant that the trust for politicians has declined. And it's led to new parties which are extreme right-wing, extreme left-wing parties sort of filling the gap. And of course, social media has taken full advantage of this with all these sites that people watch one way or another. And so the anti-establishment flag could change the kind of political dynamic across the world. The porous border flag was raised in 2012 when I facilitated a session for Interpol in Paris. And we had the heads of the police forces from around the world looking at what the big threats to the world over the next 10 years could be. And their number one flag, and this is interesting because it's not a crime, it wasn't peddling drugs or guns, it was what they called porous borders. The fact that the borders into the rich countries were very porous, they didn't have the defense, and that they said over the next 10 years, this is going to turn into a huge issue. And indeed, it has done exactly that. You have migrants trying to cross the channel into Britain every day. You have Britain saying that they're going to send people to Rwanda, which I don't think is a good idea at all. And then, of course, you've got now the Irish saying what you mustn't do is, send all these migrants to Ireland. So, it's raised a huge problem there. There's a lot of islands in the Mediterranean which are absolutely chock-a-block with immigrants because there's nowhere else to go. And in America, the southern border with Central America is a continuous problem. And right now, it's moved to the west, to where the border is between California and Central America, because apparently it's easier to get in there than it is elsewhere. But it is a major flag to watch, because I can promise you, if climate change really does a nasty job in many developing countries, you're going to see hundreds of millions, if not billions of people wanting to move to other countries. And it's not that they're evil or anything like that. It's to actually preserve their existence. And that's what makes the problem so difficult. The next flag is now, for the first time, really being talked about in financial circles. It's the national debt flag. And essentially, since the financial crash of 2008, we've had easy money policies around the world where interest rates have been were reduced to virtually zero. Lots of money was put out by governments into the economy to allow it to recover from the financial crash. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and then lots of money was put out by governments to keep businesses going. And now you have ratios of national debt to GDP, the annual product of a country, its GDP. That ratio has now gone through the roof. I mean, in America right now, national debt owed by the US government is $34 trillion. Their GDP is $27 trillion. So it's 125% of GDP, their national debt. When the agreed ceiling in the 1990s that a government should reach was 60%. So the US is now double what was the agreed ceiling in the 1990s. And Britain is around about 100%. So it's something to watch, because interest rates have gone up again. In America, they're around about 4 to 5%. In Europe, similar deal. And of course, the cost of servicing that debt because of higher interest rates has also gone up. So there is a chance that you could have that kind of trigger that one had in 2007 of subprime mortgages basically becoming worthless, which really started the financial crash. This time it could be national debt. So we have to watch that particular flag. The pandemic flag hasn't gone away. It's still there. And, apparently there are new variants of coronavirus, which have meant that, we are seeing a rise around the world. But thank heavens, these variants are pretty mild. And so we're not seeing the number of deaths that we saw during the height of the pandemic. But also, of course, it could be a completely different virus that causes the next pandemic. You have to keep that flag on your radar system. The crowded space flag is a recent flag. We now have so much stuff flying around in space. We have the satellite systems, we have rockets, we have everybody trying to land on the moon, and yet there are no laws of space. There was just a general kind of UN edict in 1967 that space belonged to everybody. And we've had some near collisions in space between rockets and satellites. And of course, if that happens, the debris from that collision could interfere with the international banking system, as well as the international communication system. So I think that over the next few years, you're going to see quite a lot of legislation around what you can and cannot do in space. And then the last flag is something everybody talks about. The artificial intelligence revolution. And, nobody knows, whether the good is going to be better than the bad, or the bad is going to outweigh the good. Nobody really knows about this flag. Obviously, it gives people much greater access to data. Anybody who's asked an AI chatbot a question gets a pretty sophisticated answer. Of course, there are many book companies and media who want to take AI producers to court for copyright because they're using that information. We'll have to see how that plays out. But whether it's going to be the good things that people become more productive as a result of using AI, or whether you're going to see just so many additional ways of hacking things, of actually this whole stuff around creating fake videos of people using their voices, which have been analyzed by AI. And you never know whether you're seeing something real or whether you're actually seeing something that's been put together by AI. So it's at the moment a very cloudy flag as to whether it's going to have long-term effects for cybersecurity, or whether it's ultimately going to lead to a much more productive world than we have at the moment. The two mainframe scenarios flowing out of these 11 flags are friendly planet, where a new generation of leaders come together to solve the big questions like climate change, to try and put together an economic model that helps solve the incredible wealth and income inequality that exists around the world, and obviously between nations of the world as well. And we move into a kind of positive phase of the world like we did in the late 80s. The negative scenario is called gilded cage. It's where the West hunkers down in its gilded cage. It makes the bars as thick as possible so that people can't get in. And then the rest of the world is allowed to continue as long as it doesn't threaten the cage. And to be quite honest, right now, is that second scenario, which is very much in play. And we have, on the one hand, we have G7 and we have NATO. And on the other hand, we have BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and now a whole host of other nations. And they're vying with one another, and we certainly don't have the kind of globalization which drove the world back to being successful after the Second World War, with freedom of movement of goods and people. That model is being endangered by the kind of gilded cage scenario. So, you know, we need to work towards the friendly planet, because the biggest threat to the world now is the environment, and the fact that it's not sustainable, with particularly climate change, and also obviously with our displacement of other natural species on this earth. We've got to seriously address that that challenge for future generations, and it can only be done in the friendly planet scenario. What are South Africa's flags? Well, they're pretty obvious. The crime and corruption flag, and whether we're making genuine attempts to bring them down. Certainly, I don't think this flag is as high up the flagpole as it was in the sort of 2010s. It's come down a bit, but it certainly hasn't come down to the point that we've got what I would call clean, effective government. There's a long way to go, and we're going to have to do things like really put more effort into our police force. You know, a lot of people are saying it's under-resourced at the moment. We still have a long way to go, and we've got to obviously, you know, take to court the people who are guilty of corruption, and they must bear the consequences. So it is probably the flag that people talk about the most. The second is the quality of infrastructure, where we all know about Eskom, but it's actually that particular part of the flag is looking better. We haven't had load shedding. There is now genuine cooperation between the private sector and government around the production and distribution of power. And this has achieved great results. And so if we can do the same for transport in this country, and for the ports, and obviously the other major areas like education and health, particularly now that NHI has been passed, then that flag will turn green. But it really needs a proper alliance between the government and the private sector. The third flag is the entrepreneurship flag, because the one thing that's happened in the world is that work has changed. In the last century, big business and big projects were employing hundreds of thousands of people everywhere around the world. But in came robots, smarter technologies, all kinds of things came in. And the major creator of jobs now in the world is small and micro business. And they've just done a recent study in America of how many of the new jobs being created every month in America are in the small business area. And it's 65% of the jobs, because Americans are entrepreneurial. They start little businesses in their hometowns, in their particular states, and then they may take on another job and things like that. So their unemployment rate is probably one of the lowest in the world at under 4%. Europe is not quite as entrepreneurial, so it has a higher unemployment rate. But what this flag indicates is that we've got to do so much after this particular election to, you know, make this economy an entrepreneurial economy. We're going to have to get rid of all the red tape that stops small business being successful in this country. We've got to integrate the township economies into the mainstream economy, because there are so many aspiring young Black entrepreneurs who could do so well if we create a much more open economy in South Africa. And that can then act as a kind of board on which people can launch their businesses internationally as well. I would like to see e-stock exchanges on the internet for each of the major cities in South Africa, so that small business can use crowdfunding by going onto these sites to to raise money for their businesses. I'd like to see big business allocate a particular percentage of their supply chain to promoting small businesses in South Africa. This is so important because this is the only way we're going to bring unemployment down to a reasonable figure, somewhere maybe around 5 to 10%. There's no other way to do it. I did a debate with Julius Malema in 2016 in February at the Cape Sun. We had a dinner organized by the Cape Town Chamber of Commerce. And I said, I am an economic freedom fighter too, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. You want to nationalize the land and the banks and the mines. I want to make sure that individual South Africans have the economic freedom to establish their own businesses wherever they want to do that. The next flag is a very obvious one. It's the 2024 election, which takes place in about a week's time. It's an incredible flag because it's 30 years after the 94 election. We've now settled down as a country. We had a very good period under Mandela. We had a pretty good period under Mbeki, and then things started falling apart in the 2010s. And our scenario team in Anglo, back in 1985-86, said there are two crossroads in order to take the high road properly. The first one is the political crossroads of becoming a proper democracy, and we did that in the early 90s. But they said the second crossroads is going to be the economic crossroads of developing an inclusive economy that goes with a democracy. And we haven't done that. And so this is a watershed election because we need to construct that new economic model as quickly as we can after the election is over. The neutrality flag is there because of this polarized world, and we saw it with the Lady R incident at Simonstown, where South Africa was accused of loading weapons onto the boat for Russians. And of course, that was shown to be false. But nevertheless, it really showed the power of this flag. And of course, our recent thing with the International Court of Justice of putting to them that that Israel is committing acts of genocide in the Gaza Strip. That has also shown how powerful this particular flag is. And so, yeah, I'm not saying that we shouldn't stick our neck above the ground. I think that's a great thing to do. But we've got to, at the same time, try and make sure that all the export markets that we have, such as America and Europe and elsewhere, that they remain open to our products, because it is a vital part of a successful economic model that we can export our goods anywhere in the world. And the last flag is around land and food security. It's still an issue. We're going to have to find better ways of spreading the ownership of land in this country. But given what's happening in Zimbabwe and Zambia at the moment, food security is an incredibly important issue. And so is water. We've all been concentrating on electricity, but distribution of water and the infrastructure behind it must also be the subject of a proper alliance between government and the private sector, as I said earlier. So what are the scenarios? And I'd like to come back to a brilliant presentation that I was given. I was at a meeting where these scenarios were presented by a group that are called the Inlulamiti Trust. Inlulamiti in Nguni means giraffe, and obviously the giraffe looks over the trees at the horizon to see what might happen there. And they've just written a new set of scenarios for 2035. And often it's the title of the scenario that really gets to you, like the high road, low road got into people's minds back in the 80s. They've come up with 3 titles of birds for these scenarios, and I asked their permission to use them, and they gave it to me. So I'd like to give you their 3 scenarios. The first one they called Hardy-Dar, and I like to call it the Hardy-Dar blah blah scenario. It's just more empty rhetoric from politicians, just like the bird has this sort of very kind of shrieking call when it's flying, and you know, it doesn't do very much, but boy, it does have a very loud voice. And you know, the kind of Hardy-Dar blah blah scenario, we will go nowhere if we just don't do anything. It's just all about the kind of rhetoric that exists afterwards. In fact, the country could descend into more enclaves if we don't address that flag of crime and corruption. So it's kind of more of the same, the Hardy-Dar blah blah scenario. The second scenario is vulture culture. It's where we get back into that terrible thing of people, you know, stealing fairly silently from, you know, the pot of what's available in the economy. And yeah, we descend even quicker than in the Hardy-Dar blah blah scenario because it is just, as we've seen already, a totally useless and destructive model. But it's the third scenario that really got to me from Inlula Miti, because it's such a good way of expressing a positive scenario. They called it Weaver's Nest. And it's where you have these small birds, weavers, sociable weavers, who get together and construct the biggest nests in the world. But they do it by teamwork together. And it's not about rhetoric or anything like that. They just do it. And they make the nest out of twigs, grass, leaves. And yeah, that is the scenario that we've got to aim for after the election, that it's a ground up economic revolution. It's not kind of all decided from above. But obviously, you've got to have the enthusiasm and get rid of a lot of the laws from above. And that's why I would like Cyril to get the same kind of entrepreneurial advisors that he had as medical advisors during the pandemic. He should get people who've started real businesses around him to say, this is what you've got to do to create this open, inclusive economy. And then he's got to do it. That's what weavers do. They don't just talk about it, they do it. And one of the great things about South Africa is that we have so many examples on the ground of weavers' nests that work, providing you have the good leadership. And that's the point, the good leadership of companies, the good leadership of communities. It's amazing what South Africans as teams can do. You know, I live in Somerset West, and you know, I go to the local shopping mall, and the restaurants there are brilliant, and they're run by teams of all colors. The shops, Woolworths, Clicks, and everything else, they work fantastically. In fact, they're world class. It's as good as going to any mall in the UK or America or anywhere else. And it's because you have these teams working together as weavers to produce the particular nest that people want to buy in that particular shop. And so we have this incredible stuff. And there are certain small towns which have done very well because they've got, you know, local government that has really done things to make industries expand in those particular towns. And I guess the biggest example I can give you is Siya Kolisi as a you know, the leadership flag, because there he is. He leads this team of, you know, people from very diverse backgrounds, and we win the Rugby World Championship. I know by 1-1-1, a very close thing, but we won it. And it's, because we actually can work together as a team, and that's what the weaver's nest scenario is all about. So, you know, this is a very, very important election, and we know that there's the three scenarios being played at the moment, that the ANC might just get over 50%. The second scenario is that they fall into the low 40s and have to do a deal with the minority parties. And of course, the third one is that they get in the low 40s and might have to do a deal with either of the two big parties, the DA or the EFF. We'll have to wait for election day to just see which scenario is going to play out, because things change very rapidly before the actual election takes place, and polls can be wrong. But whatever the result, and whoever emerges as the next government must realize that if we're going to have a positive future, they're going to have to create the kind of weaver's nest mentality in South Africa, that we all work together to make it a better place. And it happens. So I'm not as negative as other commentators, because I've just seen so many examples of, as I said, people successfully constructing weaver's nests in the private sector, to realize that if the private sector and the government work together, we can create a much better South Africa. I'd like to end with a benediction for all of you who've been listening to me. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clem, for that. We really appreciate it. We have a couple of questions here. Don't know, we still have 6 more minutes to go. So I'll start with the first one. Just a second. So it's from Lisa. She's asking, isn't population decline desirable now, considering the world's limited resources?
Okay, on population control, I have this to say. I've read an incredible book recently called The Age of Decay. You can look it up on the internet. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's a fabulous book. And what it really shows is that in the second half of this century, population could well decline hugely because of the grey flag of the aging of the world's population. But secondly, because a lot of women have decided that they want to work and they want to have less children and they want to have a more balanced life. So the actual numbers of children on average women are having around the world is declining. I mean, in South Korea, it's the lowest of all, 0.7. You know, even in Europe, it's only 1.5 or something like that. And so he's saying that actually the global population is set to decline in the second half of this century. So I would prefer that to be the kind of, you know, solution to the green flag of climate change. But equally, there are so many things that we have to do to go from fossil fuel driven industries to green industries. That's got to happen anyway. But I can say that it surprised me, this book, that we are going to see probably a global population decline in the second half of this century.
Okay, then we have another question from Ronald. He's asking, with war going around every corner of the world, are we not at a risk of World War III?
Yeah, you know, I wrote about that in the book, Flag Watching, in 2015, that the Ukraine could turn into a World War III because, you know, Russia has fears that NATO was moving from west to east and was you know, on the borders of Russia, and then Ukraine would be the kind of last last kind of country to go. I mean, I know Belarus is just north of Ukraine and isn't part of NATO, but they were getting very antsy about the Ukraine back in 2014, 2015. But equally, America feels very strongly that countries have a right to decide whether they want to go for the East or the West. And so I pose the scenario that if NATO troops got involved in Ukraine, or NATO weapons were used to obliterate targets in Russia, that could lead to a third world war, and it still can. But of course, the point about a third world war, it won't last long. 5 billion people will die, and that is virtually the end of the world as we know it, because nuclear weapons have such incredible destruction associated with them. And that's why you have this principle of mutually assured destruction. If you nuke me, I'll nuke you, and we'll both disappear. And maybe that will hold America and Russia up from actually getting into a nuclear war. But it is still out there as a scenario. I don't give it a very high probability at the moment, because I still think that MAD, the mutually assured destruction principle, applies. But you can't be sure that, with wars, there are always kind of accidental events that trigger an escalation. And I don't know whether in the Ukraine that will trigger an escalation. And obviously, this other war in Israel, that can escalate, as we saw with that brief interchange between Iran and Israel. And so, yeah, that could also, in some way, turn into a regional war. But I do think that a kind of World War III scenario, given that it could involve nuclear weapons, has a low probability at the moment.
Thank you, Clem. We have another question from Oscar. He's asking, will the NHI be used only for corruption, or do you have any input about that topic?
Yeah, I do. NHI, I'm not against NHI, because I do believe that we've got to have more, it's this whole thing of inequality. It's not just inequality of wealth, it's inequality of living standards and everything else. And NHI is incredibly important. I mean, I have to say that a member of my family 2 generations back was in Clem Attlee's government as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the late 40s. And he was, together with one of his cousins, was responsible for the national health system in the UK. And I think that the national health system in the UK is under a lot of pressure, but I think that everybody wants it to be there. So I want to see this NHI plan being implemented by a really positive partnership between the private medical care resources and the government. And that's what I want to see after the election is over. How do we implement better standards in state hospitals and allow people to visit GPs and all that kind of stuff, without obviously having a system which sends all those GPs and specialists and the people who run the private hospitals overseas because they just don't see a future here. We've got to find the right model to implement a kind of sociable weaver's nest for health in this country.
Thank you, Clem. Clem, 2 more questions. Everybody who needs to run, we will post this on our YouTube page. But I just wanted to get your input, Clem, on the various views on people that say they don't want to vote next week because there's nobody to vote for and it's kind of hopeless. What would you think? What would you make of that statement?
No, I don't think it's hopeless at all. I mean, one of the wonderful things about this election is that it's probably got the greatest variety of parties to vote for since we became a proper democracy. and they've all been doing their thing around the country. And to me, it's just sensationally awful to think that a lot of people are just so, you know, fed up with the politicians. They say, I'm just not going to, you know, consume the time necessary to vote. It's for me, I want everybody to vote. That's what a democracy is about. It's demos kratos, the power of the people. Kratos, power. Demos, people. That's why it's called democracy, power of the people. And we don't very often have the right to exercise that power. But national elections is the time that you can do so, and you can influence the future of this country. So I want as big a turnout as possible. And, you know, you've got this incredible variety of parties to vote for. It's a golden opportunity to set the country on the course to the weaver's nest by getting up and doing it, not just talking about it, doing it. And it's the first of the twigs and the leaves towards building that weaver's nest that your vote will be.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clem. Last question. There's a question on the chat about, do you think we'll ever have a war over fresh water? Was that the question?
Yeah, this is one of the things which is going on around the world. It's not, I mean, here we know about how much the Gauteng water system is under pressure, and we've got to do something about it. And, you know, there are people who can actually come up with solutions. And as I said, if we have a proper partnership, we can certainly resolve that problem in Gauteng. We have a problem in the Western Cape. We nearly ran out of water 2 years ago, and you know, various short-term solutions were put in place which got us over that crisis. But we've got to build up our long-term water infrastructure here. And as several farmers meetings have told me, which I've acted as either presenter or facilitator, it is one of the critical issues for the future of farming in this country, that we have a proper supply of water. And I have to tell you, we share that with Australia. Australia has a critical shortage of water on the Murray River because temperatures have warmed up in Australia so much that the Murray River, which is the biggest river in Australia, is evaporating, and therefore less of it is available to farmers. But where wars could happen is obviously where countries build dams which immediately decrease the water supply of the country next door downstream. And you know, we know of various places in Africa and in South America where this kind of approach is happening. But it's vital that there is a discussion between those countries about how to share the water, because it would be absolutely ridiculous for it to descend into a war.
I'm on mute. Thank you very much, Clem, for all your insights. Thank you for that download of knowledge. We are richer for having spent time with you. We thank you so much once again, and we thank all our brokers that attended this morning. We hope you are leaving with baskets full of information and you're ready to make your mark next week. And let's all do the responsible thing and go out and vote. Like Clem said, there is a whole lot of parties to choose from. So let's all make our mark and make sure that our voices are heard. Thank you, Clem.
Thank you. I loved doing this for you. And yeah, as I said at the end of my talk, may the fox be with you in building that weaver's nest.
Thank you very much, everybody. Happy iTOOsday. Thanks. Thanks, Clem.
Thank you. Thanks.